In 1820, 3 expeditions reached Antarctica almost at the same moment. That does not look like discovery. It looks like a race to replace someone else had already noticed. The official story calls it exploration. But when Britain, America, and Russia all arrive in the same narrow window, the timing stops looking innocent. Just 4 years earlier, 1816 had plunged the world into darkness. Summer failed, skies turned strange, and whole regions began to behave as if the atmosphere itself had changed. What if Antarctica was only one piece of a much larger collapse? People called it the year without a summer. Volcanoes are said to explain it, but the scale of the damage was so broad that the explanation feels too neat. The strange part was not just the cold, it was the simultaneity, the way reports of snow, darkness, and collapse appeared across distant continents together. In North America, in Europe, and in remote settlements, the same pattern kept repeating. Sudden frost, ruined crops, and the sky that looked wrong. And when institutions began to wobble, records fractured with them. Populations moved, local histories broke apart, and the official timeline suddenly looked fragile. If one volcano caused all of that, why did the damage feel global, immediate, and strangely coordinated? That question is where the story starts to bend. The theory here is simple and unsettling. 1816 may not have been only volcanic winter. It may have been the shadow of a much larger atmospheric disaster. A more modern comparison would be nuclear winter, sunlight blocked, skies dimmed, memory itself interrupted. And if that happened, Antarctica becomes the key, because on old maps the southern continent appears before the official discovery date, not as a rumor, but as a drawn coastline with real shape. That is where Tartaria enters the frame, not as a fairy tale, but as the name attached to a lost world order hidden in plain sight. The word points to something bigger than a single empire. It suggests a connected civilization, advanced enough to leave traces in architecture, maps, and infrastructure. Then comes the date that should have changed everything. In 1820, Antarctica is officially placed on the historical record, as if it had just appeared. But a beginning can also be a cover date, especially when older cartography already hinted at land that should not have been known yet. One of the clearest examples is the Piri-Reis map of 1513. It reportedly shows a southern landmass with a coastline too specific to dismiss as decoration. Piri-Reis himself said he compiled older sources. That means the information may have survived from a time before the official timeline begins to make sense. Later comparisons were even stranger. The coastline on that map appears to match the buried rock beneath miles of Antarctic ice. That is hard to explain away as luck. A coastline like that implies observation, memory, or access to a source the modern world forgot. Then there is Orontius Phineas in 1531, who reportedly depicted Antarctica without ice, complete with rivers and mountain ranges. How does a 16th century map show details modern science only confirmed centuries later? Not by chance. It suggests someone had already seen the land. So the question is not whether Antarctica existed. The question is what changed between the old maps and the world that followed 1816. Maybe the southern ice expanded after a global atmospheric shock. Maybe a colder world buried an older one. And maybe that is why the record becomes so careful after this point. Whatever was there, the pattern is stubborn. A disappearing civilization, a frozen continent, and a timeline that begins exactly when the world was breaking. And that is why Antarctica matters here. If the ice arrived after the rupture, then the continent may not be a discovery at all, but a burial. The first charts did not show a blank south. They showed coastlines, rivers, and mountain lines where no official explorer had yet sailed. That is what makes the old Antarctic maps so dangerous. They do not look like guesses, they look like memories preserved on paper. And once you accept that possibility, the timeline becomes unsettling. The map appears before the empire, before the expedition, before the modern name ever hardened. That is where the Piri-Reis map enters the story. On a 1513 chart, the southern edge is drawn with a confidence that still bothers researchers. Piri-Reis did not claim he invented everything he drew. He said older sources existed, and that detail turns a strange map into a chain of custody. That means the question is not whether one sailor guessed correctly. The real question is who had access to the older knowledge before the maps were copied. Then comes Aruntius Phineus in 1531. His southern continent is not blank either. It is carved with rivers, ridges, and interior geography. That kind of detail is not accidental decoration. A coastline can be imagined, but a river network and mountain system suggest something far less casual. If those coastlines match anything real, then someone drew from observation, not fantasy. And that possibility opens a door official chronology tries hard to keep shut. Now look at the 20th century. After the war, the southern ice was no longer a rumour. It became a strategic obsession. In 1938, Germany sent Schwabenland south. Officially, it was a mapping mission. Unofficially, it carried the weight of something more urgent. They dropped markers, photographed terrain, and claimed enormous territory. But what mattered most was what they returned home willing to discuss, and what they refused to explain, because the silence around expedition findings is often louder than the findings themselves. And in this story, that silence keeps appearing in the same places. Then came Operation High Jump in 1940. 13 ships, 33 aircraft, nearly 5,000 personnel. That is not exploration, that is a deployment. Richard Byrd led it, and the official language stayed careful, but the scale alone tells you the Americans expected more than cold weather and ice charts. By then, Antarctica had shifted from a remote frontier into a sealed strategic zone, and once a place becomes sealed, every rumour around it starts to matter. What did they think was worth sending fleets for? If this was only a frozen desert, then the military response makes very little sense. The official record never answers that cleanly. It gives logistics, dates, and maps, but it does not explain the intensity behind the mission. Then there is the Antarctic Treaty in 1959. It froze the continent politically, banned weapons, and turned the interior into an international blind spot. A continent can be visited, studied, and even photographed, but once access is controlled, the difference between seeing and verifying becomes enormous. That is why the oldest maps matter again. They imply the land was once legible, and that its later disappearance was not merely natural. What changed first, the ice or the record? And if the record was altered later, then Antarctica is not just a continent. It is a boundary line between what survived and what was buried. And if you want the deeper layer, this is where the question turns from geography to power. Who gets to decide when a place stops belonging to history and starts belonging to secrecy? If these traces are real, then the southern ice is not hiding emptiness. It is hiding a sequence, and every sequence has a beginning that someone preferred to forget. If this line of evidence kept going, what would you inspect first, the maps, the expeditions, or the treaty? Because the next layer is not about whether Antarctica was once seen. It is about what the world may have done the moment that old sight began to surface again. Not long after 1959, Antarctica stopped behaving like an open frontier and started acting like a sealed vault. The question was no longer what sat on the ice. It was who decided nobody else should reach it. That seal mattered because the modern story of Antarctica did not begin with curiosity. It began with control, and control always arrives with paperwork before it arrives with soldiers. By the mid-20th century, maps, flights, and expeditions all seemed to agree on one thing. The ice was hiding something deeper than geography. Once that idea entered the record, silence followed fast. That silence was not accidental. In Antarctica, the gap between what was known and what was admitted became its own kind of evidence. And once you follow that gap backward, you keep finding older maps, older surveys, older questions. The official timeline begins to wobble the moment those earlier sources are examined. This is where the problem becomes sharper. If Antarctica was only a blank frontier, why did so many older sources seem to remember a coastline beneath the blankness? The old charts did not all say the same thing, but they pointed in the same direction. South was not empty in the imagination of early mapmakers. South was occupied by a shape, and if a coastline was remembered, then the next question is unavoidable. Remembered by whom? That answer matters, because maps do not invent certainty by themselves. The deeper you go, the more the Antarctic story behaves like a memory that was interrupted. Not erased cleanly, interrupted, then filed away under a newer name. That newer name changed everything. Once the continent was renamed, the old possibilities were no longer discussed as history. They became speculation, and speculation is easy to bury. Look at the pattern around the expeditions themselves. Nations were not merely collecting data. They were positioning themselves around a place that seemed to matter before anyone admitted why. In that sense, the Antarctic rush was never just scientific. It was geopolitical but also archival, because whoever controlled the first modern story controlled the later meaning. That is why all charts are so disruptive. They do not prove everything, but they refuse to disappear, and the refusal itself keeps the story alive. And then there is the strange modern fact: even with advanced imaging, the most sensitive parts of Antarctica remain harder to inspect than almost anywhere else on Earth. That is where suspicion grows into structure. If the continent was once seen differently, then the modern barrier around it is not only environmental, it is informational. And informational barriers are built for one purpose: to slow the moment a hidden idea becomes widely legible. That moment, for Antarctica, may have begun in the late 1950s. The strange part is how cleanly the story was simplified afterward. Public memory kept the ice, the treaty, and the science. It did not keep the older contradictions. And that is why Tartaria keeps returning in these discussions. Not because every claim about it is settled, but because the missing pieces keep aligning too neatly with Antarctica. So the question shifts. Maybe Antarctica was not simply discovered late. Maybe it was reclassified after an older world had already been lost beneath ice and bureaucracy. If that is true, then the ice is not just a natural surface. It is an archive layer, one that preserves what the official story cannot comfortably carry. And archives are dangerous when they can be read in more than one way. One reading says exploration, another says containment, a third says someone got there first. And if someone got there first, the entire modern chronology becomes more fragile than it looks. The dates still stand, but their meaning starts to change. That is why this continent keeps pulling the same question from every direction: not what is on the ice, but what event made the world agree to stop asking. If the older site really was there, then the later freeze was not merely weather. It was a historical event, and history is often rewritten by the people who arrive afterward. So who got to decide what would be remembered? And that leaves one final thread hanging in the cold. If Antarctica was the new name, what was the old world called before the ice learned how to hide it? A sealed Antarctic supply room sits under frozen silence, as if someone shut the door and never returned. That kind of silence does not happen by accident, because when the ice takes a place, it does more than freeze water. It freezes access, memory, and the story people later tell about what was there first. That is why the old maps matter, not as decoration, but as witnesses from a time before the continent was locked behind a wall of ice. One of those witnesses is the Piri Reis chart. Its southern coastline is too deliberate to dismiss as fantasy and too specific to ignore as coincidence. And then there is the even stranger problem. The map seems to place land where modern reconstruction only confirms bedrock beneath miles of ice. That is not a casual guess. The Orontius Phineas map pushes the problem further. It shows a southern landmass with rivers and mountain chains, as if the ice had not yet learned to settle there. A map can be wrong once. But when coastlines, ridges, and drainage patterns keep matching later surveys, the word wrong starts to sound weak. So the real question is not whether old cartographers made mistakes. The question is why they kept drawing a southern world that later vanished under a shell of ice. For centuries, that southern land was treated like a blank end of the world. Yet blank spaces on maps usually mean one of two things: ignorance or concealment. And when the 19th century arrived, the official date of discovery appeared almost too neatly. Antarctica was entered into history in 1820, as if it had been waiting for paperwork. But the timing sits beside 1816 like a shadow beside a flame. First the sky darkens, then the frozen continent becomes legible to empire. That is why the old maps and the climate shock cannot be separated. If the world changed fast enough, coastlines that were once visible could have vanished under accumulation. That possibility turns Antarctica from a remote continent into a locked archive. Whatever stood there before the ice may have become its final cover. And once a place becomes a locked archive, everyone arrives with a reason. Scientists, sailors, soldiers, surveyors, and men who never write down what they really saw. The famous expeditions were not the first people to stare south with obsession. They were simply the first to bring machines large enough to turn curiosity into occupation. That is why Operation High Jump matters so much. It was not a postcard mission, it was a massive military presence sent into the ice with urgency, aircraft, and purpose. When a force that large moves that fast, it usually wants something beyond mapping. It wants control over what is found and over who gets to say what it means. The German expedition before it adds another layer. Large swaths were surveyed, claims were planted, and then the records drift into that familiar zone of strategic quiet. And once the war ended, former enemies and new rivals kept circling the same frozen ground. That kind of repetition usually means the map itself is only part of the prize. What if the prize was not land, but evidence? Evidence that the southern continent had a history older than the one later stamped into official atlases. By 1959, the treaty made that whole continent look peaceful on paper. But peace on paper can also mean silence enforced by agreement. Because the treaty did not make Antarctica ordinary, it made it harder to question, harder to enter, and easier to describe from a distance than to inspect up close. If an older world was buried there, then every layer of ice is also a layer of delay. Not destruction alone, but postponement. That is why the old question refuses to die. If Antarctica is only Antarctica, why does its paper trail behave like a rewritten ending? And if the next layer ever opens, it will not begin with a headline. It will begin with the thing the ice was asked to keep hidden. At the bottom of the paper trail, Antarctica does not look like a discovery. It looks like a conclusion someone wanted buried under ice. The first problem is not the map. It is the silence around who drew it, who copied it, and who later decided to forget it. By the time the Antarctic story became official, the older version had already been stripped down to a date and a few signatures. That matters because a rewritten ending usually starts with a missing beginning. And Antarctica's beginning has more missing pieces than people admit. The accepted story says the continent was noticed in 1820, but noticed is a careful word when the record suddenly appears fully formed. Three powers reached the same frozen frontier in the same narrow window: Britain, America, and Russia. Separate flags, same destination. When that happens, coincidence stops sounding like an explanation and starts sounding like a cover story with better manners. And the older maps make that cover story harder to maintain. They place southern land on charts long before the official date. Piri Ras is the first name people reach for because the coast looks too deliberate to be luck. It is not a smear, it is a coastline. Modern comparisons turn that coastline into a problem. The shape lines up with terrain hidden beneath kilometers of ice. Then Orontius Phineas goes even further. His 1531 map shows a southern landmass with rivers, mountains, and inner structure. That is not a lucky sketch. Rivers, ridges, and coastlines do not appear by accident on 500-year-old parchment. It suggests older source material and possibly a world that knew the South before the ice did. That's the part historians avoid. And then the climate story enters. 1816 turns everything cold, dark, and unstable, as if the planet had crossed an invisible threshold. The official explanation reaches for Tambora. But the scale of the damage keeps spilling beyond one volcano and one hemisphere. When nearly every region reports the same shock at once, the event stops behaving like weather and starts behaving like a system failure. This is where Tartaria becomes more than a fringe word. It becomes a label for a lost continuity, a before state with broken records. Not an empire in the textbook sense, something older, wider, and more connected than the official mapmakers wanted to preserve. If that world existed, then 1816 may have marked the moment its southern edge froze in place. The ice would be a monument, not a climate note. That is why the 1820 date matters so much. It does not sit comfortably as a first sighting. It sits like a formal entry after the collapse. By then, the ice would already have changed the rules. A place once mapped by memory would become a place guarded by distance. And once distance becomes policy, the public is left with names instead of access. Antarctica becomes a continent everyone can mention, but few can examine. That is the real fracture line. Not the ice itself, but the managed uncertainty around what lies beneath it. Maybe that is why the archives feel so tense. They do not just record exploration, They preserved the moment a hidden world was sealed over, and with it the traces of what may have been taken before the lock was set. So the question left standing is simple. If Antarctica was not just frozen, but harvested and then sealed, what exactly was removed from the continent before the silence began, and who decided it should never be counted?